Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is gonna be a fun one. We're gonna be looking at how biological systems, especially the brain, can be so reliable even though they're built on, kind of a foundation of randomness and unpredictability.
Mhm.
It's almost like finding out that a gourmet chef just throws ingredients together with no recipe, but somehow always ends up making a delicious meal.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, actually. And you're right, it does seem kind of counterintuitive at first
Yeah.
when you think about it that way. But the truth is, there's a lot more noise and variability going on in biology than I think a lot of us realize.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the sources we're looking at today actually uses this really fascinating analogy to kind of explain this whole thing. And it's about German Premier League soccer games.
Okay.
And at first you're like, what does that have to do with, the brain or biology? But stick with me here.
All right, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Yeah. So think about it. Any given game could go either way, right? It's a nail biter. You never really know who's going to win. But then when you zoom out and look at the season as a whole, the ratio of home wins away, wins and draws, stays remarkably consistent year after year.
I see where you're going with this. It's like
Ah,
the predictability of these robust ratios, even when the individual events are totally chaotic. This isn't just about soccer, though, is it?
no, not at all. That's exactly what makes it such a good example. It highlights this fundamental principle that we see all over in biology, these stable, higher-level patterns emerging from the unpredictable actions of all these individual components that the source actually refers to them as autonomous agents.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So in that soccer analogy, then each player
Right.
would be kind of like an autonomous agent,
Right.
just focused on their own immediate actions and reactions
Definitely.
to what's happening around them. But they're all contributing to the overall flow of the game
Yeah.
without necessarily even knowing the big picture strategy.
Exactly. And it's not just soccer players. I mean, think about the growth cones of neurons. Reaching out to make those connections during development, they're basically acting like little scouts, exploring their surroundings and making contact with other things based on just these local cues.
So each growth cone is an autonomous agent then, following these relatively simple rules to kind of contribute to this much larger structure.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating to me is how these really simple individual actions can create these incredibly intricate and robust structures, like dendrites, those complex branching extensions of neurons. It's the perfect visual example of this whole concept playing out.
Yeah, it really is amazing when you think about it. And this kind of leads us to another concept that the source highlights, which is called the levels problem.
The levels problem.
Yeah. So it's this idea that you can't fully understand a system just by looking at its individual parts.
Right. It's like saying, I want to understand how traffic flows, but I'm only going to observe one car.
Right.
Each driver is making all these independent decisions. Yeah. But somehow all those individual actions result in a relatively predictable flow of traffic.
Right. So we need to look at those interactions between all those individual components to really understand how the system functions as a whole. So how does this whole levels problem actually play out in the brain?
Well, consider the idea of dynamic normality. This is the idea that each individual neuron and even each growth cone experiences a constantly changing environment. Yet that environment always seems perfectly suited to its needs at that very moment.
So wait, it's like each part of the brain is playing this role in this incredibly intricate self-organizing dance.
Exactly. And one way this self-organization might be happening is through a process called stigmergy.
Stigmergy. Okay, I'm all ears. That sounds intense.
Which is a beautiful concept, really. Think of termites building those massive mounds. They do it indirectly by modifying their environment. Each termite leaves behind these pheromone trails on little mud balls, which attracts other termites to build in the same area.
So they're communicating and coordinating without directly interacting with each other.
Precisely. And some scientists think that similar principles might be at play during brain development. All these constant modifications and responses happening between those developing neurons could be what leads to the brain's overall structure.
That's mind-boggling. It really challenges the way we often think about biological research, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It challenges that traditional A causes B approach, which so often falls short.
Yeah.
When we're dealing with systems that are as complex and interconnected as the brain.
Right.
And, it turns out that a psychiatrist named Ross Ashby was already thinking about this way back in the mid-20th century. He was exploring these self-organizing systems, and he even predicted that the brain itself might work this way.
Wow, so these ideas have been around for a while, but it seems like we're just starting to appreciate how important they really are. But here's what I'm wondering. If everything is so interconnected and dynamic, how can we even begin to understand it all, let alone manipulate it?
You've hit on a major challenge in biological research, for sure. Think about genetic mutations, for example. Even small changes can cascade through the system and have all these unpredictable effects. It's like trying to reprogram this complex, ever-changing jigsaw puzzle.
And yet evolution somehow manages to do it right. It programs these intricate neural networks through random mutation and selection. So maybe there's hope for us yet.
I think there is hope, but it might require a shift in our thinking. Instead of simply trying to replicate the end result, maybe we need to focus on understanding the underlying principles of biological development, the principle of self-organization. Maybe that holds the key to creating truly intelligent artificial systems.
That's a really interesting thought. We're going to have to dive into that a little bit deeper. But first, we got to take quick breaks. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
Yeah, it really is a paradigm shift. It's like instead of asking what causes this specific outcome, we need to start asking what are the rules of the game that allow this kind of self-organization to occur in the first place.
Right. So how do we even begin to unravel those rules? I mean, it sounds incredibly complex.
Well, one approach is to observe biological systems in action, to really pay close attention to the interactions and behaviors of all those individual components. And the source mentioned some really fascinating research on something called synaptotropic growth, which I think provides a really interesting glimpse into how these simple rules can lead to the formation of these intricate neural structures.
Okay, so synaptotropic growth. Break that down for me.
Well, remember those neuronal growth cones we talked about earlier, the ones acting like little scouts?
Yeah.
So synaptotropic growth suggests that these growth cones can actually sense the presence of potential synaptic partners, even at a distance.
Oh, wow. So they're not just randomly exploring their surroundings. There's some sort of directionality to their movements?
Exactly. The source uses this great analogy of scouts searching for partners. The growth cones extend these tiny little finger-like projections called philopodia, and they're constantly probing their environment. When a philopodia makes contact with a suitable synaptic partner, the connection stabilizes, and then the growth cone can actually branch out further from that point.
It's like they're following a trail of breadcrumbs, leading them to their target.
Yeah, in a way, yes. And this whole process can result in some incredibly beautiful and complex dendritic structures. The source actually mentions the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum, which have these elaborately branched dendrites that almost look like delicate sprawling trees.
Wow, I can picture those.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing to think that these structures are essentially self-assembled, guided by these simple rules of synaptotropic growth.
Yeah, it's a great example of how a decentralized self-organizing process can achieve this level of complexity and sophistication. That would be incredibly difficult to design or engineer from like a top-down perspective.
Right. But even if we can observe these processes and start to identify some of those rules, is it really possible to capture that kind of dynamic complexity in something like a computer model?
It's a huge challenge, and we're definitely not there yet. But the source points out that researchers in artificial intelligence have been exploring this concept of autonomous agents for decades. One of the pioneers in this field was Marvin Minsky, who proposed this idea of a society of mind.
Okay, a society of mind.
Yeah, so his idea was that intelligence might actually arise from the interactions of many simple independent agents, each with its own limited set of rules and capabilities.
So kind of like those termite colonies, building those mounds through stigmergy.
Exactly. Minsky believed that. By understanding how these agents interact and cooperate, we might be able to create artificial systems that exhibit a similar kind of emergent intelligence.
So if these agents are all acting independently, though, how do they know what to do? How do they coordinate their actions?
That's where the environment comes in. Remember that concept of dynamic normality we talked about?
Yeah.
Each agent is constantly responding to its local environment, which is itself being shaped by the actions of all the other agents.
Oh, so it's like a feedback loop. The agents are both influencing and being influenced by their surroundings.
Precisely. And that constant interplay between agents and their environment can lead to the emergence of surprisingly complex and coordinated behaviors. Think about how ants find food, for example. Each individual ant might seem to be wandering randomly, but collectively, they're able to efficiently locate and retrieve food sources.
So there's no central planner, like directing the ants' movements. It's all happening through those local interactions and responses to those environmental cues. Wow, this is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about how the brain works.
It really challenges our assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the same principle might apply to the development of the brain. Those intricate patterns of neural connections might not be pre-programmed in our genes, but rather they might emerge from the dynamic interactions, like billions of neurons, each acting as an autonomous agent.
So in a way, our brains might be more like ant colonies than we realize, constantly adapting and self-organizing based on all these local interactions.
That's a very thought-provoking way to put it, and it really highlights how much we still have to learn about the brain and the principles of self-organization. It's a humbling thought, but also incredibly exciting.
It is. This whole idea of self-organization is mind-blowing. I mean, it really challenges our traditional notions of how biological systems work.
Right. But if we can start to crack the code of self-organization, it could have profound implications for so many fields. Think about artificial intelligence, regenerative medicine. The possibilities are endless.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. And what are some of the biggest implications for you?
Well, I think we might be approaching the limits of what we can actually explain. Using our current reductionist framework, that traditional scientific method, we need a new language, a new way of thinking about complexity and emergence. So where do we go from here then? Well, one avenue that the source suggests is to delve deeper into the work of those early pioneers, like Ross Ashby.
Oh, Ross Ashby. The psychiatrist who was studying self-organizing systems back in the mid-20th century.
That's right, he recognized that. In a truly self-organizing system, each part is constantly adapting to an environment that is shaped by all the other parts. It's a concept he called ultrastability.
Ultrastability, it sounds like a superpower.
Yeah. So what does ultrastability actually mean? Well, it's the ability of a system to maintain its overall stability and function, even when faced with all these unpredictable disturbances. Think of a ship staying afloat in a storm. It's a great metaphor, I think, for ultrastability in the brain.
Ah, I like that.
It might hold the key to understanding how biological systems achieve such remarkable robustness and resilience.
So by studying Ashby's work, then, we might gain insights into how to design artificial systems that are similarly adaptable and resilient. Like, could we build robots that can think on their feet and adapt to unexpected situations?
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, it might help us to better appreciate the incredible complexity and beauty of the natural world.
This deep dive has certainly opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about biological systems. It's both humbling and inspiring to realize how much we still have to learn. Okay, so this is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit it also seems a bit overwhelming if we're shifting our focus away from individual components to these larger scale interactions and these self-organizing principles. Doesn't that actually make things even harder to study? I mean, how do you even design experiments when you're dealing with so much interconnectedness?
Well, it definitely presents new challenges, but it also opens up some really exciting possibilities. The source actually mentions using computer simulations to explore how different rules and parameters influence the emergence of these complex patterns. It's like building a virtual lab where we can tweak things and observe how the system evolves over time.
So kind of like those artificial life simulations you see, where you have these little digital organisms evolving and adapting. Could we essentially create like a mini brain in a computer?
That's the idea. And by comparing those simulations to real biological systems, we can actually start to refine our understanding of the principles that are at play.
That sounds really powerful, but how do we even make sure that these simulations are actually reflecting what's happening in a real brain?
That's a crucial question.
Okay.
And it requires a constant back and forth between modeling and experimentation. We need to ground our simulations in real-world data and confirm our predictions with actual observations. It's an ongoing process of refinement and discovery.
So it's not about replacing traditional biological research, but using these simulations as a complementary tool to explore questions that might be difficult or even impossible to address through experiments alone.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that even the most sophisticated simulations are still just that, simulations. They can give us valuable insights, but they can't fully replicate the complexity of a living organism.
Right, which brings us back to the limitations of our current scientific methods. The source talks about how that traditional A causes B approach can be really misleading when we're dealing with these self-organizing systems.
Yeah, in a system like the brain, a single gene might influence multiple aspects of development, and its effects might depend on this whole network of interacting factors. It's much more intricate than a simple cause and effect relationship.
So how do we move beyond that A causes B mindset then?
Well, the source suggests thinking in terms of algorithms and feedback loops. Instead of looking for single causes, We need to focus on understanding the rules that govern how the system interacts and responds to its environment.
So more like figuring out the operating system of a computer than trying to decipher the individual lines of code.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the importance of considering the system as a whole.
Okay, so this whole idea of self-organization, it's truly mind-blowing, but I have to admit it is a little intimidating. It makes me wonder if we'll ever really be able to understand something as complex as the human brain.
Is a humbling thought for sure. But I think that's part of what makes science so exciting. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
And who knows what kind of breakthroughs might be possible. Once we unlock the secrets of self-organization, it could revolutionize everything from biology to AI.
It's a transformative concept, and I think we're only just beginning to understand its true potential.
Well, this deep dive has given me so much to think about. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those unpredictable soccer games to the intricate dance of those growth cones, to the mind-boggling complexity of these self-organizing systems.
We've explored how randomness can actually be a source of robustness and creativity in biological systems, and how these simple rules can lead to such incredible complexity.
And we've even touched on some pretty deep philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and free will.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you're feeling inspired to learn more.
I definitely am. And for our listeners who want to delve deeper, the source recommends exploring the work of Ross Ashby and the concept of stigmergy.
Those are excellent starting points for anyone who wants to understand the principles of self-organization and their implications for biology, technology, and even beyond.
Well, it's been a pleasure diving into this with you today, so keep those brains buzzing. And until next time.